Hello, and welcome to today's live reading of 10,000 Shells and Counting, a memoir by Nadija Mujagic, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Forward. Dr. Wexler, wake up. My psychotherapist was a gentleman in his 80s who, remarkably, had never written notes during our sessions, but memorized almost every detail I had shared with him over several years. As my workplace was around the corner from his office, I'd visit him during my lunch break once a week. More often than not, I'd see him walking around Cambridge, his tall figure bent on one side. He was legally blind, so I never attempted to say hello, thinking he'd never see and recognize me. He fell asleep in his chair often, and I would yell out his name until he was alert again. Dr. Wexler, why do you fall asleep during the session? This is not what I'm paying you for. I can't help it. There's something you're not telling me, so I doze off involuntarily. After several months of seeing Dr. Wexler on a weekly basis, he gave me an official diagnosis: PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. When I came home and looked up on the internet what that exactly meant, it came as no surprise. According to the National Institutes of Health website, a person suffering from PTSD may re-experience traumatic events through flashbacks, bad dreams, or frightening thoughts. The person may feel emotionally numb, depressed, or may experience strong guilt for extended periods of time. When I turned 14, a war broke out in my country, Yugoslavia. Back then, and now, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ever since the war ended, I have had two recurring dreams. In one dream, a war was about to start again, and I planned to commit suicide or escape because, recollecting my neighbor's experience, I would be too afraid to face people who would have my life in their hands and dispose or do whatever they please with it. In another dream, the same enemy occupied a neighborhood my family and I lived in, and we were all in hiding, waiting to be found and executed on the spot. These dreams were often vivid, and they would wake me up just as shell blasted, or the enemy got closer in my dream. These dreams were as horrifying and real as the experience once was. In recounting both the dreams and war stories in my head, I have felt desperately alone, as though no soul could ever sympathize or understand who I was and what caused me to withdraw or become distant from even myself. Yet, going through this experience, I know that I am not alone. As I write this, there are wars going on in several countries. No matter what country a war takes place in, I'm almost certain that the story I'm about to tell is like many of those stories by victims of these events. When I first came to the United States, I found a temporary job at Harvard University, scheduling audiovisual equipment for classes and studying sessions. My shared desk was in the basement of the Science Center, which has never seen a ray of sunshine. It was dark and depressing, and if you were claustrophobic, you would probably need to quit on your second day of the job. One day, I noticed my colleague's speech, his lisp getting on my nerves, and it felt as if 1,000 little bugs were crawling on my skin and I was trying to escape. When he whistled, I would cringe, and my body would become so tense that I wanted to run as fast as I could. Many years later, I discovered that the disease is called misophonia, or, as a literal translation would suggest, a hatred for sounds. As the disease progressed, I had noticed many other sounds driving me insane. When I attempted to get help from a professional, the disease was not well studied to date and that there was no known cure. But there could be methods developed to minimize the impact of the inconveniences so that your daily life was normalized and you didn't have to run away from many social situations and interactions. For example, meditation would help. The therapist told me that my central nervous system was most likely damaged, which made my senses much more sensitive than those of an average person. In recollecting all my war experiences, that certainly made sense. During the 3.5-year war, I must have heard over 10,000 shells falling near me, causing me to twitch, jump, and react in terror and fear. 10,000 shells seemed like a drop in the ocean, a tiny piece of a scab on an old wound. In his attempt to help me deal with PTSD, Dr. Wexler listened with kindness and non-judgment. When I felt depressed and anxious, he would tell me that prescription drugs were not the way to go. Instead, he would tell me, "You need to talk, Nadja. Get this all out of your system." So here I am, timely or not, I have made a conscious decision to tell my war story. This is the story of a girl who spent most of her teenage years in a war. These are the events that led up to the person I am today. As I write this memoir, I think of all past, present, and future PTSD victims, whether their PTSD was caused by a state of an armed conflict between nations or simply by an internal struggle. Regardless of what causes traumatic events, I know they breed pain. Remember to be gentle and kind with yourself. Chapter 1: The Beginnings. The military don't start wars, politicians start wars. William Westmoreland. We will no longer be in control if we get into a situation where Croatia and Slovenia were, especially Croatia. That hell would be 10,000 times worse in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There would be no way to stop it. I ask you once again, I am not threatening, I am pleading, that you take seriously the political will of the Serbian people represented here by the Serbian Democratic Party, the Serbian Renewal Movement, and some Serbs from other parties. I plead with you to fully understand that what you are doing is not good. The road that you are choosing for Bosnia and Herzegovina is the same highway to hell and suffering that Slovenia and Croatia have already taken. Do not think you will not take Bosnia and Herzegovina to hell and the Muslim people maybe into extinction. You son of a bitch, my father yelled at the TV screen as Radovan Karadzic calmly stood at the podium, talking into a microphone with his wild white hair and a pronounced chin dimple. Quiet, Munib, the neighbors will hear you, my mother whispered, timid. I don't care. I would punch this son of a bitch right now if I could. My father was not a violent man. In fact, he was sweet, always smiling and friendly with the neighbors and their kids. He was born right after World War II in a family of 4 other siblings, with parents, like most people, struggling to provide for their children in the aftermath of the war. Growing up, my father had no shoes to wear. So before he went to school, he had to wait for his older brother to return home so he could wear his pair. My grandfather, from the stories I had heard, was violent, quick to lose his temper and take it out on my grandmother. My grandmother, a quiet and sweet lady, always smiled when we came to visit. She had beautiful, bright blue eyes, with one eye sparkling in the right light. My father told us one day that my grandfather punched my grandmother's eye, causing her to lose it and have it replaced with a fake one. My father didn't get along with his father, and he strived not to become like him. As much as he resisted resembling his father, he couldn't help it. When sporadic bickering with my mother ensued, they yelled and screamed at each other, but the children, my older sister Amra and I, would observe and eventually got used to their form of communication. We knew they wouldn't lay their hands on us. As my father Munib listened to Karadzic, he was growing red, angry, unable to control his composure. Karadzic's threat was uncalled for. His calm deliverance of potential chaos to come seemed provoking, arrogant, and something to cope with in the only way one could, angrily. I had not seen my father this angry ever since Amra disobeyed my parents and not come home until a couple hours after her curfew. My parents were strict. When she arrived home around midnight for the first and only time I had witnessed, my father took a belt out and beat the crap out of her. She cried, and I cried with her to ease the pain. In October 1991, the war in Croatia was in full swing. Karadzic was giving a speech to the Bosnian parliament in response to Bosnia's mandate to separate from Yugoslavia. I didn't know what it all meant, this whole business with Croatia and now Bosnia. There was war there. There could be war here, but I couldn't even picture what that might look like. The only thing I could think of were my maternal grandmother's words when we, her grandchildren, had left food crumbs on the table. Eat up everything. God forbid if war broke out. You would have nothing to eat. She'd survived World War I and II. I did not know what war looked like outside of old World War II footage I had watched on TV when I was sick and bundled in blankets excused from school. Like the footage suggested, I imagined a bunch of soldiers getting out of the trench and running as fast as possible toward the enemy line while pointing the gun in the enemy's direction. Above would be a flock of planes dropping bombs on the land while soldiers were falling and dying in their distinct hard olive helmets and uniforms. Civilians would stay home and watch plane parades from the windows, and when needed, they would run to the shelter to hide from the attack. My grandmother never shared her war stories, and no one ever asked. Perhaps she was just old and had to say these things to show off her wisdom of age. Karajik's speech continued. As he uttered the words of urgent threat, chills went down my spine. Because if a war breaks out, the Muslim people will not be able to defend themselves. Chapter 2. Home. War may sometimes be a necessary evil, but no matter how necessary, it is always an evil, never a good. We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children. Jimmy Carter. My parents, Amra, and I lived in a suburb of Sarajevo, Aerodromsko Naselje, or the airport neighborhood, right across the street from the Sarajevo International Airport, Butmir, and about a 15-minute ride from downtown on a good day. Our street was named after Georgy Dimitrov, a person whose identity or credentials none of us cared to learn. Most streets in Sarajevo were named after fallen war heroes, politicians from the communist era, or famous artists. Our street was long and was shaped like a half oval. From the windows of my room, I could see the airport building, unobstructed in sight, and a tall, deep green mountain Igman standing in the background. Growing up, I was accustomed to the windows shaking from powerful plane engines ascending into the sky. The buildings in my neighborhood were 2 stories high, all well maintained, with colorful flowers in front of every building and many balconies, with leaves and blossoms hanging over the railings. My father had taken care of the building front and planted a couple of roses in each corner of the hedges. A year before the war, he had planted a small cherry tree close to the entrance of our garage and one in the backyard. Our apartment was tiny, about 600 square feet, facing both the airport in the back and the street we lived on in the front. Alma and I shared a room, whereas the living room also served as a bedroom where my parents slept. Next to the living room was a small kitchen and a dining room, and between the rooms was a narrow hallway with the entrance to the apartment and a bathroom. One could walk in circles, entering different parts of the apartment, and often when we misbehaved, our parents chased Amara and I in circles until we stormed into the bathroom and locked ourselves behind the door. The space did not give any of us much privacy, so Amara and I loved when our parents were at work. We could play music as loud as possible, reaching our neighbors across the street. We often invited our friends over to watch German porn on VHS tapes my father had hid in our brown sectional and giggled and laughed nervously at most obscene images. The neighborhood was safe. It was mixed as far as nationalities. In our building lived Muslims, Serbs, and Croats. A couple below us, with 2 children, were a Muslim and a Croat. Across the way from us lived a mixed couple with 2 children, a Serb and a Croat, and the others were Muslim. Next door lived a couple with 2 children, one of whom was a girl named Jasmina, a year older than me, and who I befriended when I was practically a baby. We moved into the apartment in 1979 when it was first built, so everything was brand new and fresh. Whether this is a fruit of my imagination or an actual memory, I recall Amara walking me through the living room, placing her hands under my armpits as if she was teaching me to walk. The mustard yellow couch sat on one side and a brown vanity on the opposite side of the room. My parents placed the furniture randomly until they decided on the best location. I was less than a year old, and the parquet stood at a small distance from my eyes. The apartment was our new home. Back then, the government handed apartments to employees after they were waitlisted for free. The socialist regime in Yugoslavia gave people safety and comfort. Everyone had equal assets, and competition was kept at bay. Being a good neighbor was sacred. We had Melina across the way bringing sweets every so often. Her marzipan, a cocoa cake, was the best and well-known among the neighbors. Our downstairs neighbor often checked up on me when I had just returned from school and was home alone. Another downstairs neighbor came to visit practically daily, often just as my mother arrived from work, until my mother put a stop to it one day because she was too tired to socialize. The neighborhood felt like a family. And like every family, we had our disagreements, but everyone knew we could count on each other. Being a Muslim, a Croat, or Serb was never a source of contention. Rather, being a bad neighbor was. The only time an unusual occurrence happened was a murder taking place in our street. A boyfriend of the girl who lived in one of the townhouses showed up one day. They were breaking up or quibbling over relationship-related stuff. And in the heat of the moment, he stabbed her with a knife. Her younger brother came in to help, but he was weak and unprepared, so he got stabbed as well. Both died. And I don't know if the murder took place right before we all showed up to watch the police handcuff the murderer and escort him to the police car, but I remember the whole ordeal being peaceful. I was horrified. I looked at the man in the trench coat approaching the police car with his head down, and I was feeling sad about losing the siblings' lives. The shock permeated across the neighborhood until one day it was gone and forgotten.